Good morning from a frigid Colorado. It's a balmy 0 degrees this morning, and today I'm going to tell you a tale of three companies and the state of the semiconductor industry from a technological and production point of view. Now, if you go back to the world before 2017, the technology of the day was something called deep ultraviolet. Which was basically a way of producing microchips. And Intel, the American technological giant, was the world leader by pretty much any measure. And they had gotten a little cocky and they had gotten a little bit lazy. So they would design chips 2, 3, 4 models out, but would only produce the next one up. Because they were so far ahead of everybody else, they didn't feel the need to jump steps. So they would use DUV, and they would make a chip that was marginally better than the one before. And then at the end of the year, no one had caught up, so they'd do it again and again and again. And they did this for like 15 years. I mean, they're very good at what they do, but they could have pushed the technological envelope a lot more had they chosen to. In part, that was because of the nature of DUV technology. The problem with it is you have to kind of make micro adjustments and physically adjust the equipment for each type of chip, and you have to do that manually and physically. And so with every design, you had to do it all over. And with every machine in a fabrication facility, you would have to do it independently. So no new chips from different machines are going to be quite exactly alike, and it generated a relatively higher loss rate from the final semiconductors than what we have today, and so generated a little bit more waste. But again, they were the industry leader, no one was close. Well, they were always had their eye on the future, however, and so they invested in new technologies that would take them beyond DUV, one of which is EUV, extreme ultraviolet. And the company that developed that technology is ASML out of the Netherlands. And back in 2016, ASML thought this stuff was ready to go. So they're providing demonstrations for Intel, showing them how this technology is better. You can not only get more nodes on a chip and get to smaller and smaller nanometers, but it's all digital. So you kind of type in what you want to the machine over the course of a few days to a few weeks, and then the machine doesn't actually have to be physically manipulated in the way that DUV did. Now, what that would mean is you'd have a higher success rate and more efficiency, but back in 2016, Intel was like, I don't think this technology is quite right, and we're the industry leader, we're going to give it a few more years. Well, ASML, not very happy with that, marketed the technology to everybody else, and a company decided to take the plunge. That company is TSMC out of Taiwan. And when we get to 2017, TSMC suddenly hits the ball out of the park and proves that EUV is ready for mass application, and over the next couple of years very rapidly overtakes Intel because they have a shorter turnaround time for their chips, and they can make chips with smaller nanometer sections. It isn't until 2022 or 2023 that Intel finally makes its first extreme ultraviolet chip. So TSMC in Taiwan has been the industry leader now for several years. Now, we've had a kind of a reverse in the roles now. ASML, the Dutch, have another new technology called high numerical aperture, whose physics I'm not even going to pretend to understand, and they have marketed again, and this time Intel is the one that's behind, and they're kind of desperate and kind of hungry, and TSMC is the one that's resting on their laurels. So the first delivery of those new machines, the high-NA chips, went to Intel in the second week of January of this year. And Intel expects two things. Number one, they plan to overtake TSMC using the EUV technology in 2024, hoping to get down to 2 nanometers. Right now, the industry lead is at about 3 nanometers, and that's a TSMC product. And then next year, they hope to leapfrog even further, provided that these new high-NA machines work, which we'll find out pretty soon. Anyway, that's where we are right now. In terms of the overall geopolitics, it's pretty straightforward. Right now, 90% of all high-end chips are made by one company, TSMC, in one city in Taiwan. It's a high concentration. But if Intel, working with ASML, can pull this off, all of a sudden we will have facilities in the United States that are working on the higher-end stuff, with some of the first facilities that are going to be going online outside of Phoenix and Columbus, Ohio. So stay tuned, because the geography of these chips is about to evolve pretty significantly if high-NA works. And if not, we're still stuck with Taiwan. It could be worse. Everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from Doubtful Sound, and in this next in our series of regional geopolitics in a post-American world, I want to talk about Northern Europe, specifically the Scandinavian region. Now, this is an area that has been fractured by history. You've got islands, you've got peninsulas, you've got de facto city-states, but while they have been powerful in the past, they've kind of been sleeping for the last 300 years. And during the Cold War and the post-Cold War era, it's been fractured into a number of different governments. But I think the best way to think about this is not so much a collection of countries, but a family of Vikings who are getting to know each other again. The original Vikings were the Danes and the Swedes, who basically went off, raided and pillaged, and founded little trading depots everywhere that they went, and some of those depots eventually rose to become significant countries in themselves. Think of Riga in Latvia, or Oslo in Norway, or Reykjavik in Iceland. But by the time we get to the modern era, they had been broken into different spheres of influence. In the post-Cold War environment, however, especially now with the Ukraine war happening, we're seeing a changing of fortunes as these countries are rediscovering each other. And we're already in an environment where a lot of them consider themselves so familial that they already have a lot of joint embassies around the world. But if there's one thing they're all concerned about, it's Russia. Denmark is the last country approaching the Baltic Sea, so that if the Russians ever make a bid to get into the open ocean, they go by them. The Norwegians control the northern coastline, so they know the North Point is something they're responsible for. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania used to be Russian colonies under the Soviet period, and Sweden is a mid-sized power that was ultimately smashed by Russian power 3 centuries ago, and only recently has kind of emerged, whereas Finland was both a Swedish territory and a Russian territory, based on which time frame you're looking at, and only really became independent in a traditional sense in the last decade or so, as it's broken away from its Finlandization programs, which were basically a way that the Soviets used to crush Finns' strategic autonomy. What we're seeing now is this whole cluster of countries coming back together, all on the same side of the same geopolitical orientation, no longer fractured by other powers, with Sweden absolutely being the center weight of all of it. It's probably best to think of most of these countries not so much as countries, but as cities that just happen to own another swath of territory. So in the case of, say, Riga or Copenhagen or Oslo, over half, in fact, almost 3/4 of the population is in that one city, and the rest of the territory just kind of hangs on. Sweden is the exception. I mean, yes, Stockholm is by far the largest, but it actually has a populated zone in the south that is agricultural. There are a number of cities going up and down the Baltic Sea coast. And so it is arguably as powerful, if not more powerful, than all of the others put together. And now that Sweden is emerging from its traditional neutrality and starting to write its own security policies, it is going to be a major force to be reckoned with. A couple things about this region to keep in mind. Number one, it is very, very naval. Because of the Baltic Sea, because of the Gulf of Bothnia, this is a zone that if they're going to survive, they have to do so in the context of having a powerful navy to keep potential rivals at bay. And that means, number two, it's actually fairly easy for them to partner with other powers from out of region, assuming for the moment that those other powers are also naval. Because if they were to partner with, say, the French or the Germans, who are primarily land powers, these countries would see themselves overwhelmed. They're just not big enough. Sweden doesn't even have 10 million people versus, say, France is roughly 60. The whole region put together can't add up to a France, much less a Germany. But if you bring in the United Kingdom, you've got a very different sort of power dynamic. And the United Kingdom, like the Swedes, like the Danes, like the Estonians, really doesn't want to see a single large mega power emerge in the Eurasian or the European space, because that would be a threat to their naval independence. And so the Brits have always gotten along spectacularly with all of the Scandinavians, and now that the Swedes and the Finns are ditching neutrality, the partnership between London and these places is very strong. To a lesser degree, the United States is in the same place. Now, the United States overall is looking to slim down its security commitments moving forward, but it doesn't take a lot of cooperation between the Americans and, say, the Finns and the Swedes and the Norwegians in order to achieve some outside outcomes, because all of the Scandinavians just want to maintain independence. which means they're always going to be to a degree hostile to anything that happens in Moscow and to a lesser degree continental Europe. That means for a very small price, the United States can really achieve some outsized outcomes working through some very capable partners. So we should start to think of the relationship between the Americans and the Baltics and the Norwegians and the Scandinavians, however you want to define the cluster, as very similar to the American relationship with Australia. A powerful, creative ally that punches above its weight, that's going to do its own thing for its own reason, but which dovetails with American power moving forward. All right. That's it for me. Catch you guys next time.
Everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from home, and I have received, no surprise here, lots and lots of questions about Tucker Carlson's interview with the Russian leader Vladimir Putin. There's really no point in going to the substance of Tucker's interview. A couple things to keep in mind about Tucker Carlson. Number one, he's been fired from every journalistic job that he has ever had for making things up. And his legal defense when he was working at Fox in recent years was that he's not a journalist at all. So he's not responsible for any sort of fact-based reporting. In fact, he literally called himself a propagandist. Which, I guess if you're going to go for a legal defense, being truthful helps. And he's been a Russian shill for several years. So the idea that he was being a Russian shill in Russia doesn't really shock me. And it was just an example of how Putin can get his message out in front of a relatively favorable audience in the United States to stir the political pot and keep the United States unable to make a broad-based response to anything that the Russians are doing. And this is not a new program. The Russians have been doing this ever since they formed the bot farm over a decade ago. More importantly is the strategic picture that we have in the Russian space right now. The Ukraine war is not at a stalemate. It hasn't been for any part of this war. We've been seeing new tactics and new weapon systems moving. The current iteration is the Russians are combining their meat assaults, as they've been called, with a much better level of coordination with other tactics, especially with artillery. One of the things to keep in mind about the Ukraine war is that we've got two very different approaches. On the Ukrainian side, authority has been devolved down to almost the unit level. But when you disassociate your military strategy to that level, yes, you'll get a lot of creative people who are doing creative things that are very effective. But the information and the successes that they have, the techniques don't necessarily percolate back up to the top, which means that it's hard for the folks at the top to then apply those tactics across the entire front. So you get very, very effective commanders, but you don't necessarily get a very, very effective army. Russia has the opposite approach in that there's very little authority at the local level. And so they often have the Ukrainians running circles around them. But whenever a lesson does percolate up to the top, it is then imposed on everyone. And for the first couple of years of the war, this has definitely been working for the Ukrainians' favor, but as the Russians incrementally incorporate lessons, it's now starting to favor the Russians. And the only way that you can kind of make the Ukrainians come up again, two things. Number one, you can get them better at a little bit of command and control. And then second, of course, they need better and better weapons in order to counter what is becoming an incrementally more effective Russian war machine. That, of course, is wrapped up with politics in the Western countries, especially the United States, which is one of the many, many, many reasons that Putin arranged for his shill to come and interview him in order to keep stirring the pot so the United States would have more and more problems when it comes to acting. Just as important, arguably more important, is the Russians are thrilled about what's going on with Israel and Gaza and Iran, because every little bit of attention that the Americans give to the Israeli situation or the Gaza situation or the attacks on maritime shipping in the Red Sea is an attention that they can't give to the Ukraine war. One of the things that people forget about the American foreign policy establishment, it really has a hard time dealing with more than one issue at a time. And so for the first 16, 18 months of the Ukraine war, that was the only issue in international affairs that was in front of Joe Biden. You could argue that things with China were up there, but that was mostly in the area of economic nationalism, and that is something that can be handed off to non-foreign policy personnel. But in the United States, there's really only three people who are responsible for almost all American foreign policy. The president, obviously, the chair of the Federal Reserve, and that's usually focused on economic issues for obvious reasons, and the National Security Advisor. Even the Secretary of State really doesn't deal with foreign affairs. It's more of a dispensation rather than a policy creation sort of issue. And so when you only have three people, and one of them obviously has other things on his plate at any given time, and one of them is only responsible for financial and economic issues, it's really hard to get this mammoth institution of the United States focused on more than one thing at the same time. And if Israel and Gaza and Iran are absorbing more and more and more of that attention, then by default, there's less attention that can be paid to things going on in the Russian sphere. So the Russians have, from the fourth quarter of last year on, discovered that they have a lot more wiggle room because the leadership out of the United States is simply lacking. It's not that we've had a policy change in Washington. It's just that there's only so much bandwidth, and of course now we're in an election year, and that snarls things even more. So ignore Tucker. You should have been ignoring Tucker for years, but do watch Moscow because they're finding new and more creative ways, not simply to prosecute the war at home, but to muddle the picture on a broader global scale to play into this fact that the Americans have a hard time focusing on more than one thing.
Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from Huron Peak in central Colorado, and today we're going to talk about Romania. Romania is one of those middle powers that kind of has been dealt a bad hand. It's got a good chunk of land in the lower Danube, and it's bracketed by the Carpathian Mountains, but it's not quite big enough to kind of stand up to the neighbors. So it's got these three access points, really. You've got the Vienna Gap to the northwest that allows access to the northern European plain. You've got the Bessarabian Gap to the northeast, which allows access to what I call the Eurasian Hordelands. And then down south, you've got the Balkan Mountains that pinch off access to the Sea of Marmara region. Now, the northern European plain, the Hordelands, and Marmara are all capable of supporting absolutely massive powers that have dominated history as long as it's been recorded. And Romania is kind of stuck in the middle. It has access to all three of them, but could never generate the sort of military force that is necessarily to punch out beyond those gaps and do anything meaningful. In fact, because it's proximate to all of these gaps, it is usually one of the first countries that gets conquered or amalgamated when one of those three mega regions decides that it wants to expand beyond their natural borders. And in that sort of environment, Romania faces a double bind. Number one, whether it's coming from the northern European plain or Marmara or the Eurasian Hordelands, it's got to decide whether it's going to fight or whether it's going to accede. And if it chooses to accede, then it is not in charge of its own destiny anymore, and it usually ends up being a cog in somebody else's empire. The second problem is that Romania, while being the most populous of the countries in this squeeze zone in between, is certainly not the only one. And there are others that might be a little bit more defensible and have a little bit richer geography. And Romania is in constant competition with all of them. So even if it can make its peace with its larger neighbors, it then has to make peace with its smaller neighbors. Some, like Bulgaria, it usually gets along with pretty well. Others, like Serbia, are touchy. But probably the biggest problem of all of them is Hungary. Two problems here. Number one, Hungary has a little bit more defensive of a geography than Romania, so it has a little bit longer history in terms of being an independent power, especially since it is up against that northern European plain gap. Bessarabia is a 50-mile gap, and it's really hard for a country the size of Romania to plug that. But the Vienna Gap is only a couple miles wide, and most of that is the Danube River, making it fairly easy for even a small country like Hungary to hold the line. That means that Hungary and Romania are the two countries that tend to find themselves fighting more often than even the major powers that are in the lands beyond. And if you want to go just back to the Cold War, there were these delightful stories that came out at the end about how, yes, we were in a Cold War of the West versus the Soviet Empire, but within the Soviet Empire, the Hungarian and the Romanian intelligence services were duking it out behind the scenes while they were technically on the same side. Now, looking forward, the Romanians have some decisions to make. They know that the European system is of limited duration. They know that it's in demographic decline, and they know that there's going to be a fight for the region once again, just like there has in every age of their history that has been recorded to this point.
Until very recently, they were convinced that when the Russians came again, they'd have to cut a deal, that they wouldn't have a choice. But the Russians are doing so poorly in Ukraine, the Romanians are starting to entertain the possibility that there might not even be a major power on the other side of the Bessarabian Gap again. And that means that the other regional power that they would probably have to cut a deal with, Turkey, becomes a lot more digestible. Turkey's an up-and-coming power. The relations with the Romanians going back centuries have been pretty good. They've been excellent since the Cold War. Maybe a little cool, but certainly professional. And if the Romanians are entering a world where the Russians are no longer a strategic factor, but Turkey is, then that's a partnership. That's not vassaldom. And that could potentially spell the greatest chapter in Romanian history to date. There are plenty of caveats in that statement. Romania has among the world's worst demographies. They are one of the top 10 countries in the world for using abortion as a birth control method, and they're among the worst demographic structures in Europe. They're going to have to find a new economic model, and they're going to have to figure out what happens post-EU and maybe even post-NATO. These are all big questions, but the fact that they've got a rising partner in Turkey right next door, but not directly adjacent, Bulgaria's in the way, that's a pretty good setup. All right, that's it. Take care.
Hey everybody, winter is here. I'm coming to you from Eastern Washington, and today we're going to talk about winter in Texas. Now, if you guys remember back a couple of years, I think it was 2021, Texas got hit by a cold storm and basically everything collapsed. All of their energy generation, especially natural gas, just ceased functioning. And 200 people died over the course of a couple of weeks because of the lost electricity. That has not repeated with this cold front, even though by many measures in most parts of the state, temperatures got a little bit lower. So 5 things are different now compared to what happened back in 2021. First of all, while it did get as cold or even a little colder, the cold snap wasn't quite as long. It didn't last like the 2.5 weeks like it did last time. So the system wasn't put under as much long-term stress. But the bigger issues have to do with organizational and structural changes that the Texans have implemented. The big driving factor for things on the legal side and the regulatory side was Governor Abbott, who had spent a lot of time before 2021 making fun of California for their rolling brown and blackouts because they just have a horrible grid and a horrible energy system. And then, of course, in Texas, you had 200 people die, so he was personally motivated to make some changes. And he pushed them through the legislature, which forced the regulatory structures in Texas to adjust. And the biggest part of those changes affected the natural gas industry. So Texas, before 2021, didn't have its natural gas system winterized at all. And there's a lot of water vapor that comes up as a byproduct of natural gas production, and a lot of time it's in the gathering pipes. So what would happen when we got to sub-freezing temperatures is that water vapor would condense into liquid and eventually condense into ice and then clog the pipes. So the entire system across especially northern Texas and the Dallas area froze up, and so there was no fuel to burn to do everything else. For political reasons, Abbott blamed the wind industry because, the wind did stop going, but it was mostly natural gas that carries the backbone of power generation in Texas, and that is what failed most spectacularly. So in order to get things going, they actually had to waive almost all of their safety regimens and regulations, and people were going out with acetylene torches to manually melt the pipes. And of course, natural gas is flammable and explosive, so we were kind of lucky that didn't get completely out of hand. Anyway, this time around, the changes in regulations forced producers across Texas to actually implement some of the best winterizing technologies that we had back in the 1960s. And the Texas grid now is on par with where Arkansas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico were about 1975. So, this is some really basic stuff when it comes to things like insulation. Anyway, it was more than enough to make a difference. Okay, so that was the first big structural change. The other big structural changes had nothing to do with regulation. It's just how things have evolved. So the new turbines, wind turbines that the Texans have put up are more than 200 feet taller than the ones that were up 3 years ago. And that means they reach higher, they tap stronger air currents that are more reliable. So even though the wind did drop, we didn't see nearly the drop-off in power generation capacity because the physical structure is now different. Second, Texas has put up a whole lot of solar. And when these winter storms come through Texas, usually what you get is a lot of wind, a lot of freezing rain, maybe some snow. And then once they blow through, it's cold, but it's clear. And so when you have temperatures in the 20s, solar doesn't really care what the temperature is unless it's like crazy low or crazy high. So solar was generating near record energy for the time of year. So you had two different streams of energy coming into the electrical system that they didn't really have last time, and their baseload system with natural gas worked a lot better than it did. This sort of change is the sort of thing we're going to see in some way across not just Texas, but the entire country and the eventual world. We're seeing more and more wind and more and more solar, and it doesn't always go right the first time. And we discover that meshing these systems together is more problematic than kind of the breezy things that the Greens say. But when you have multiple systems that do feed into the same network, you do get a lot of redundancy when one works and the other doesn't. The trick is to make sure you have enough spare capacity that you can dispatch at any given time. Now, in the past, solar and wind aren't very good at that because you can't dispatch them. If the sun's not out, if the wind's not blowing, they're kind of useless, and you have to rely on older fossil fuel things like natural gas. But what we're seeing in Texas specifically is that we're already seeing turbines that are 800 meters tall. And in the next year or two, we're going to be pushing the kilometer tall barrier. And again, stronger currents, more reliable, used for baseload. So I don't mean to suggest that all of these problems when it comes to storms and interruptions are going to go away. But as the technology evolves, we're getting better able to adapt and having a little bit more insulation on the backside as well. That's it from me. Hey everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from a very foggy Colorado. It is the 16th of February, and the news today is that Russian prison authorities have announced the death of Alexei Navalny, who was a political prisoner who had the audacity to criticize Vladimir Putin and run for office long ago, years ago, and has been in prison ever since. He was transferred about a year ago to a high-security prison in the middle of nowhere in Siberia. It was an old Soviet gulag. This is basically where the Russian government sends people when they want them to die because it's cold, it's brutal, there's no heat, and medical service is deliberately denied. So the idea that he's dead is not exactly a shock. The Russian government very well could have actually executed him, and no one would know. Now, back in 2021, the Biden administration said the death of Navalny would trigger a collapse in international relations that would really punish the Russians. But since then, the Russians have launched a war and killed a couple 100,000 people in Ukraine. So pretty much all of the stops that could be pulled out have been pulled out. And about the only way to punish the Russians now would be to send a lot more weapons to Ukraine or to do an outright block of all of their energy exports, neither of which on the moment, for a mix of political and economic reasons, are on deck. So I don't want to say anything weird like, the Russians are going to get away with this because there's a lot going on, but don't expect any sort of tactical response from the Americans in general or the West. Now, before anyone gets to crying about this, a couple things to keep in mind. Number one, Russia's not a democracy. It hasn't really been a democracy in over 20 years. So even if Navalny was allowed to continue to be part of the political conversation in Russia, it's not like he has any chance of changing policy. He was more of a personal annoyance to Putin and nothing more. There are other people within the ruling party who have decided to run for presidency against Putin on a very nationalist ticket, but just be opposed to the war, and they're not being allowed to participate either. So it really doesn't matter. It's something that pro-democracy activists in the West get really excited about because he's a name that more people know, but he was never going to have any influence. Second, careful what you wish for. Navalny may have been a nicer guy than Putin because, low bar, but he was just as nationalist. And his biggest criticism of the Ukraine war wasn't that it was happening, but it just wasn't being prosecuted very well. People forget that the strong predilection among Russians is to continue the war. They just don't want to be part of it personally. The idea that Russia needs to expand its borders in order to survive is not one that is particularly debated in Russia. It's generally been their security policy for 400 years, that as long as your external borders are flat and open, you're not safe. So you have to go through Ukraine to get to Romania and Poland and the rest. Now, of course, that's bad for Romania and Poland and the rest, but the Russians are not misreading the map. And unfortunately, that gets wrapped up in the political discussion so that folks like Mulvaney appear more important than they really are. So, I mean, I feel bad for the guy and his family, but we were probably always going to get here. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan coming to you from Colorado, where we're about to get another 6 inches of snow. A lot of you have written in about the Biden administration's decision to put an operational pause pending further review on liquefied natural gas exports. There are a lot of people talking a lot of things on all sides. On the energy industry side, they're saying that this is a breach of proper protocol and it's going to really inhibit future investments across the sector. And on the environmentalist side, they're talking about how this is the end of that sector altogether, and they're dancing and singing Kumbaya. Everybody's wrong. Let me kind of lay out what this stuff is. So natural gas is normally transported by pipe because it's difficult to move, it's difficult to store, it's difficult to produce. And so you'll have a pipe network like in North America that is separate from the pipe network in Europe, which is separate from the pipe network in China. Those are the three big ones. You got some smaller ones around the world. They don't connect, or they can't connect. And so if you want to link these together, what you need to do is have a facility on a coast that will chill the stuff down to something like negative 300 degrees or so. And then it's a liquid, and then you put it into a specially designed tanker that can handle these cryogenic fluids. And then you transport it across the ocean to another facility where it unloads and is regasified and then put into the new system. Now, we've been doing this for a few decades, but it's only in the last 15 years that it's really started to become big. And the primary reason for that is the environmental movement, because natural gas, if it's properly burned in an appropriate facility, a combined cycle natural gas plant, generates about half of the CO2 emissions of, say, a coal plant. Also, you can spin up a natural gas facility in just a few minutes, as opposed to a coal facility, which can take hours to even days. And so if you want to pair it with, say, wind and solar, it's the perfect complement fuel, because when the sun goes down or when the wind stops, you can just turn this thing on. And so if you want to get the full capacity from your wind and your solars, you really have to have a conventional system that's dispatchable like natural gas. Now, the United States currently has enough capacity, nameplate capacity, to chill and ship about 13 billion cubic feet of this stuff per day, which makes it the largest exporter in the world already. And under construction are facilities that would allow another 12 BCF per day, which, if you remove the United States' existing capacity from that, that's again the world's largest. And then there has already been stuff permitted for another 16 billion cubic feet per day. So, you add those three together and, where we are right now, that's enough to supply all of Japan. If we bring all of these online, that's almost enough to supply all of Europe. And the Biden freeze doesn't touch any of that. It is a pause of the review process for new facilities. Now, if the United States were to bring these all online, so 13 today, 12 in a few years, and down the road, maybe another 16, you're talking... 40? Yeah, it's more than 40 BCF. And that would be roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of total U.S. consumption of natural gas. If we did get the number that high, we'd have a lot more price linkage between the U.S. market and everywhere else. Remember, natural gas is pretty much sequestered, and LNG has traditionally just kind of played at the margins. But if we had this kind of volume, then Americans would start to be exposed to global natural gas prices. If that were to happen, instead of this $2 to $5 range that we've kind of become used to and is probably going to be our norm for the next few decades, we'd probably see prices regularly going above 15 or 20 as we have international price shocks because of things like, the Ukraine war, or something blowing up in the Middle East. When you only have about 10% exposure, or in our cases a little bit, 10%? Yeah, we got about 10% exposure. The price swings are very muted. And so back in 2021, when the Ukraine war was hot and heavy, and we thought we were going to lose all the Russian gas at the same time, the Europeans were dealing with natural gas prices that were well over 70 for a few months, and it was pretty ugly for their industrial stuff. Anyway, let's talk about what people are talking about with this. On the industry side, The idea that we're going to build out past 40 is kind of a stretch anyway, so the oil companies are just whinging because someone's telling them that they can't do anything right now. Second, the Biden administration has not oversold this. They're saying it's a temporary pause of the review process to consider climate change. Well, if you want to consider climate change, natural gas is the perfect fuel to ship out in bulk because it's the only thing that really pairs with solar or wind. You're not going to do this with coal. That would be silly. And batteries sound great until you realize the industrial process that's required to build them at scale is never going to make them more than a niche use in specific areas. I'm not saying there's no use for them there, but natural gas is so much easier. It's so much cheaper. And by most measures, it's actually a lot cleaner too. So you're only going to put batteries in places like Phoenix maybe, where the solar intensity can be really, really high, and they just need to save some, for nights. And then on the environmental side, the celebrations, number one, this is not forever. It's a temporary pause of the review process, which the Biden administration can reverse with a stroke of a pen, or any additional leader could, for reasons environmental, economic, or strategic. Remember that a lot of the stuff that's getting shipped out right now is going to Europe in order to allow the Europeans an option other than sucking down Russian gas. So, this is kind of important from that front too. So everyone's kind of making a really big deal out of it, but I think the thing that is most hilarious is that the Biden administration has found a way, again, to satisfy the environmental activists without actually changing the system. This is very similar to what he did when he came into the presidency and he put a moratorium on fracking on federal lands, and everyone was all wailing and gnashing their teeth on one side and screaming bloody delight on the other side. Well, people forget that 99% of all shale operations are on private land, and that is regulated by the states. So it was less than 1% of wells that were affected at all. But it made the environmentalists happy, and it pissed off the energy industry, but it didn't really change anything at all. And Biden is never going to be the preferred candidate of the energy industry, and he was able to placate some of his more hardcore supporters. He's now done that again. So it's a fairly savvy political move that actually moves the needle not at all, which, is one of the smarter things you can say about politics these days. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan coming to you from Colorado. The big news over the weekend is that a Hong Kong court has ruled that China's largest property development group, Evergrande, is bankrupt and needs to be broken up. This is something that the Chinese government has spent a lot of effort on the last 2 years not happening because, well, let me give you a little backstory. So there's two big things that dominate the Chinese economy. The first is something I call hyper-financialization, the idea that the government both de facto confiscates the savings of the citizen population so it can only go into projects funded by Chinese state banks, as well as massively expanding the money supply to a tune of like almost triple what we have here in the United States in order to make sure that there is plenty of cash sloshing around in the system so that banks can loan anything in any amount at low terms to anyone at any time. Because if they can do that, they can expand, and hire. And people who have jobs don't go on long walks in large groups together. It's a public stability, political control approach to finance. It's not about profit. It's about throughput, because throughput requires a lot of bodies. Anyway, that's the goal. In that sort of situation, you get two things. Number one, you get companies like Evergrande who gorge on all this bottomless supply of debt to build, even if there's no demand. Second, you get a population who knows that their private savings is almost worthless because the Chinese government is forcing them to keep it in the state banks. And they want to put it into a hard asset that preferably the state can't control. And if they can't get their money out of the country, then the next best thing is a hard asset in the country, which typically is property. So you get people pooling their private savings in order to buy condos. And each condo is typically owned by a different consortium of private individuals, making untangling it. Also, you have somewhere probably in the vicinity of 1.5 billion units in the country that have never been lived in, never will be lived in. So you're talking about 100% overbuild conservatively. Some estimates say it's as high as 3 billion, which is just so far beyond stupid. Anyway,
Evergrande going down means that their debts aren't going to be serviced anymore, and the physical assets they have are going to be parceled up, and foreign investors are going to be coming in and seeing what bits that they can get. None of these things are things that the Chinese Communist Party would normally allow to happen. So, there's a couple ways that this can go. None of them are good. Option number one is we follow a Western-style bankruptcy and restitution program where this system is broken up and a lot of their assets are sold at pennies, maybe dimes on a dollar, and it just goes away. If that happens, we will have a very clear idea of just how much the oversupply in the market is, and you can count on private citizens being up in arms. Probably, the best estimate I've seen out of China is that 70% of total private savings is wrapped up in real estate, and most of these assets are worth no more than 10 cents on the dollar. So if you have a fire sale of the single largest player, which controls 1/6 of the market, holy shit, things are going to get real very, very, very quickly. Option number two is that the Chinese step in and abrogate the Hong Kong ruling. Now, legally, this cannot happen, but the Chinese Communist Party is not really big on legal details when it comes to Hong Kong in particular, and I have no doubt that they could stick their noses in that. If that happens, then Evergrande goes on some sort of state drip, and everything with the system just kind of limps on, with the understanding now that Hong Kong has no legal authority over its own holdings, which will start an exodus of what few international firms are still there. Regardless how this goes, don't expect anything in the market to get better. This is not like, say, the TARP program that the United States put into place back in 2008 at the bottom of the subprime crisis, which kind of froze the market and put a floor under things and allowed for reforms and economic growth to eventually heal the damage of the subprime crisis. No. This is a one-off decision that is not just holding back one rock from rolling down the hill. Evergrande may be the biggest player in this market, but it is by far not the only one who's been doing stupid things like this, building condos that have no demand or running it like a Ponzi scheme. Every development company in the country basically operates this way, and the second and third largest players in the industry are state-owned. So you can count on the Chinese government not using this as an opportunity to break with the old model and put into place something sustainable. And even if all of a sudden this place were run by a bunch of Austrian economists, it's too late. Housing demand, legitimate housing demand for houses that people actually live in is dominated by people aged 20 to 45, people who are starting out. Well, 45 years ago, the Chinese government instituted the one-child policy. You combine that with the most rapid urbanization program in human history, and there are no longer enough people under age 45 to do anything that is consumption-led, including home buying. So there is no path out of this that follows any pattern that we have established in a market environment, which leads us to political and social outcomes where the market economics are just atrocious and getting worse by the day, with a government that is becoming ever more nervous about the state of the economy and the loyalty of its population. I don't want to say anything overly dramatic as like this is where it all starts to fall apart, because we've had a lot of things like that go down in the last 18 months. But this cuts to the core of what enables the average citizen to actually support the government. And there's no way we move forward from this without a lot of side damage.